Professor Tim Noakes. All right, man. You are an authority when it comes down to exercise, low carb, fat adaptation. But I have to ask you before we dive into anything, what did you have for breakfast today, man?
For breakfast, I always have the same. I have a little biscuit with cheese and butter on it. That's breakfast. Occasionally we have eggs and bacon, but today I had a very gentle day. I was more fasting than eating meals.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, mine was.
But I'm just getting ready to eat dinner now, which will be chicken and some other form of maybe sweet potato. That'll be what it is. Yeah.
Oh, perfect. That's my jam as well. Okay, yeah. So I want to jump right into the world of exercise, low carb, exercise in a depleted state. And what I mean by that is the idea of being fat adapted. It comes under fire all the time because opponents of this world will say that, well, fat adaptation doesn't really matter. Metabolic flexibility doesn't really exist because it's just occurs through training. But you and I have created a lot of content, and I know you've talked a lot about this surrounding the world of fat adaptation. And I think there are some misnomers out there. Can you give just a blanket overhead view of what fat adaptation is in an athlete?
Well, fat adaptation is the natural state of humans. That's what we evolved. We evolved like that because we weren't exposed to carbohydrates. Now, as soon as you start eating carbohydrates, you limit yourself to burn carbohydrates. Why? Because the body has to get rid of the carbohydrates to regulate your blood glucose concentration. That's the fundamental feature of carbohydrates. You do need some for your brain function, no argument. You do need for kidney function, no argument. However, the main function, the main reason you burn carbohydrates is simply to get rid of it. So anytime you're eating a lot of carbs and storing it in your muscles and the liver, the brain says, oops, we've got too much carbs on board. We must get rid of it because this person is going to eat more carbs in 2 or 3 hours, and we have to have a place where you can store it. So my belief is that we store carbohydrate in muscle and liver purely to regulate your blood glucose, to keep it as low as possible without having to spike too much insulin to drive it into the cells and so on. So the reason why you have metabolic inflexibility is because you're eating a high carbohydrate diet and your muscles are full of carbohydrate. And so therefore they're always burning carbohydrate. However, if you stop eating carbohydrates for a few days, within days, your ability to burn fat shoots up. And Louise Burke, who we have lots of disagreements with Louise, but she's done some fabulous work in really well-trained athletes. And she found within 5 days, converting to a high-fat diet, you can burn huge amounts of fat, 1.6, 1.7 grams per minute, values that were never seen before the fat adaptation diet came along. So that's my view, is that fat adaptation is not fat adaptation. It's carbohydrate adaptation. That's the key. Fat adaptation is the normal pattern. Carbohydrate adaptation is there to try to get rid of the carbohydrate, keep your insulin low, and protect your health for the long term.
That's a very interesting way of putting it.
Special link down below for 20% off of these suckers, macadamia nuts from House of Macadamia. But it's not just 20% off. There's also a free box of Namibian sea salt macadamia nuts. That's literally a free entire box with whatever your purchase is. So the cool thing about House of Macadamia is specifically their bars. So their bars, the first ingredient is macadamia nuts. I challenge you, if you go to like any grocery store, look at the macadamia nut bars, and it might have macadamia nuts somewhere in the ingredient list, but these are legit. The first ingredient, we're talking like 45% macadamia nuts. We're talking keto friendly, low carb, also vegan if that's what you're into. The whole thing is amazing, and they're harvested in South Africa. The proceeds benefit the farmers. The farmers have ownership in the company. They're taking the world by storm. That's why you're seeing them on Joe Rogan. That's why you're seeing them on Tim Ferriss. They're everywhere. But that special link down below is a 20% off discount link exclusively for people that watch my video. So it's a special link and a special offer. So you got to use that link, and then you add the macadamia nuts to your cart, and they will get taken off when you check out. So that's how it works, just to make sure you can take advantage of the offer. So check that link out down below in the description.
So this idea of fat adaptation or carb adaptation, this can happen as soon as 5 days. So is this happening just in a simply you don't have to be in a ketogenic state. It's something you could put yourself in a very depleted state. You could just train in an ultimately kind of the train low, kind of sleep low study type fashion where you just deplete yourself.
Yeah, I think so. We did some fabulous studies in the 1990s. And of course, I didn't realize what we did. We wanted to work out, why do you stop? Why do you get tired? And when your blood glucose is low, why do you stop exercising? And so what we did was we got people to do high carbohydrate depletion exercise, and then we infused them with either glucose or glucose plus insulin, which is quite challenging. And then we had them exercise. And the remarkable finding was that, so you've got people who are muscle glycogen depleted, and you infuse them with glucose. It's like there wasn't any glucose there. The body ignores it. It doesn't try to use it because it's so programmed under these states. When muscle glycogen is low, you're going to burn fat. And even if you infuse glucose, it says, I don't want that glucose. I'm going to burn the fat. So that kind of slightly maybe contradicts what I said earlier, or you might think it does, but that's the finding. If the muscle glycogen is low, the body is going to burn fat, come what may. And so that's the reality. And conversely, if the muscle's full of glycogen, it's going to burn glycogen. And so the muscle, in a sense, and its content of fuel determines what you're going to burn. It's not so much insulin. We used to say, well, if your insulin's low, then you're going to be burning fat. No, the reason why your insulin's low is because your muscle glycogen's low and your liver glycogen's low. That's why you're burning fat. And the low insulin is a consequence of the low muscle and liver glycogen content.
Interesting. So in the case of, say, a low carb athlete that has a decent amount of glycogen stored via gluconeogenesis, are they able to switch back and forth a little bit faster? I mean, in the essence of, they really can't start burning fat until their glycogen stores are drained. If they're replenishing glycogen quickly via gluconeogenesis, does that inhibit the fat oxidation, or is there a different mechanism that's kind of occurring there in a heavily fat adapted low carb athlete?
No, that's a great question, because I hadn't really thought of it before. But when we studied fat adapted elite athletes, we found that instant they start exercise, they're burning 1.7 grams per minute, the instant they start. Now, we didn't do muscle biopsy, so we don't know what their muscle glycogen content, but we know from other studies that probably was half of the normal. So that's the one point. So I would think that most athletes, when they start exercise, if they're well trained and they haven't got full muscle glycogen content, they're going to burn lots of fat. Now, the next point is, and I don't disagree with Jeff Volek very often because he's a giant and I'm a little pipsqueak compared to his knowledge of metabolism. When we studied athletes adapted to a high-fat diet, we studied average recreational athletes. He studied the world's best ultra-distance runners adapted to a high-fat diet. So there's two totally different qualities of athletes. We found that our guys had half the muscle glycogen of people eating a higher carbohydrate diet, similar quality athletes. In his study, he found muscle glycogen was exactly the same, whether you were if you're elite athlete, whether you carb loaded or not. And I found that really strange because it conflicted with my beliefs. So let's say he's right, and let's say that's true. Nevertheless, he found very high rates of fat oxidation in his athletes. So in his athletes with high muscle glycogen, they also had very high rates of fat oxidation, also from the start of exercise. And that is the difference. You can't take in one exercise bout, you can't take an athlete who's carbohydrate adapted, burning 0.5 of a gram of fat, can't get them up to 1.7. It can't do it. You'll have to go 12 hours without eating or something. But the athlete who's fat adapted, it starts at 1.5 immediately.
Interesting.
Now, there's another interesting point that we've recently shown, and I'm sure you're going to come to this, that athletes who aren't great athletes but are fat adapted after 4 weeks, when during high intensity exercise, working at 86% of VO2 max, they were able to burn 2 grams or more per minute. And that provides 76 kilojoules of energy per minute. Now, Eliud Kipchoge, he didn't have a good run in Boston recently, but when he runs a 2-hour marathon, he's burning 75 kilojoules per minute.
Holy cow.
So technically, the world's best marathon runners could run on fat alone without carbohydrate.
So then
no
why,
one's tested that,
why?
and maybe they never will. But that's what our study is showing, that if you're properly elite athlete and adapted, maybe you could run all these races just on fat at 2-hour marathon pace.
That's always what's been interesting to me, is perhaps these elite marathoners that are still supplementing with carbohydrates. Perhaps it's just almost the psychosomatic thing where they just don't want to try it. They've been doing it for so long, and it's a big risk for them, right? It's a big risk to say, oh, I'm going to train without this, because they can't afford to miss, even a month of good training. So I totally understand that. And if we look at even an anaerobic athlete, I'll use, myself sort of anecdotally here. I do a lot of CrossFit style training where I'm kind of in this metabolic gray area, if you want to call it that. I do a lot of aerobic work, and then I transition into highly anaerobic in the same workouts. I very much so find that when I am eating very low carb, that I actually transition better. I find that I transition from that aerobic state into that anaerobic state better. My theory, I don't know if this is correct or not, my theory is that because my baseline is so much better fat oxidation, that I can maintain sort of this homeostatic kind of aerobic capacity that's just kind of my endurance kind of burn. And then when I do need to demand more anaerobic energy, when I do need to actually pull from that, I have glycogen available for that and only that. I'm not having to use it for the rest of my baseline, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I like that analogy. Now, let me extend it a bit further. So now, I was always interested in marathons and ultra marathons. And what interests me is what happens after 3 hours when you're glycogen depleted. Because if you're a good athlete and running at 6 minutes a mile, which is 3:45 a K, and you run 50 miles, there's going to be a point when you run out of glycogen. It has to happen. You can't go for 5 hours on glycogen. So what happens when you suddenly fall off the cliff and you've got no glycogen left? I don't know what you do. You have to slow down, because your burning fat is not going to be up to capacity. On the other hand, if you're fat adapted, you can do those 5 hours on fat alone. So you're never going to fall off the edge at the end. And that's where I think I would go along with your analogy, that you've got what you need. The fat is what your muscles need, and you can burn it. Now, let's take your example. Your assumption is that when you're doing that high-intensity exercise, you can't be burning fat. Well, you could be burning fat up to 100% of your VO2 max and supplement with phosphocreatine or ATP that's in the muscle. You might not need to even break down glycogen, or anyway, it's there. So I quite agree with you. You've got but your base is much higher, to which you add phosphocreatine breakdown and ATP breakdown.
Yeah, and
but if you start down here and you add, if you're already at your limit because you can't burn fat, you're already using glycolysis to a great extent, then you've not got the same amount of ATP and phosphocreatine to break down. So that's one argument. But I honestly think that nutrition has very little to do with exercise performance. And that's another strange argument. And the reality is, if the body was designed that your muscles were dependent on energy production for performance. Sorry, I must rephrase that a bit. The point is, the body can't allow you to go push yourself beyond a certain limit to where your ATP falls in the muscles, which is the old model, that when you're running out of energy, your muscle can't produce ATP. Well, if you can't produce ATP, you have to go into rigor. The muscle has to go into rigor. And the brain's not going to allow that to happen. So the brain anticipates, okay, you want to exercise this amount. I'm going to allow you to do it for a short time, but then I'm going to cut it off, and you're not going to be able to recruit muscle, and your work performance will go down. So I think one of the problems is people like myself and other exercise physiologists, because we had to be important and we had to be able to explain things, we said it's all glycogen or it's ATP. But it's not, it's the brain. The brain is there to check that these things don't run out. And so I think the public have been misled, the running public and the sporting public, that it's all about nutrition. It's not all about nutrition. It's rather more complex than that. It's how much you slept the night before. It's what your mood is like. And I'm reading the beautiful book by Patrick Sang, who trained Eliud Kipchoge from a little child. And he said, it's the total being. That's what makes the athlete. Is not how much carbohydrate they eat the night before. The rest.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I mean, as someone that has been, low carb for a good majority of my life, but I mean, I have to say the difference in my performance between being higher carb for me is maybe 150 grams at the most, but it's negligible. It really is a negligible difference. Exactly. What comes down to it is the level of stress, the level of, my mental state, as you would obviously call it, my central governor. That is a very big piece for me, and what drives my ability to push through. And it's very little to do. I find that sometimes all that carbohydrates provide for me is almost a psychological stimulus where I feel like because I consume some watermelon, I want to burn it. It's not, I don't even know if it's physiologically doing anything that's providing me anything more than if I was in a completely depleted state.
Yeah, I must take one proviso there to our discussions. Currently, I'm writing a paper which I've been working on for about a year, and it looks at all the studies of carbohydrate ingestion during exercise or before exercise, before or during. And there are a number of studies where you can't explain the carbohydrate effect. And the only effect you can use is that it's a central stimulant, that it's a drug. And I'm very certain that for example, a 1 hour time trial, no question, ingest carbohydrate during the race, you'll do better. I would never argue that. Metabolism doesn't change. No measurable difference. The way carbohydrates work is your experiment, you have to set up the experiment so that the control group, their blood glucose drops during exercise, i.e. the placebo group. Then you'll always find an effect of carbohydrates. If their blood glucose doesn't fall, you won't find an effect. That's in a longer event. In a short event, you'll almost always find an effect of carbohydrate, but it's not metabolically, doesn't do anything. So what is it doing? It's acting in the brain. So I honestly think carbohydrate is a drug. And that's why Tour de France cyclists use it so much, because when you're cycling 6 hours a day, you often need a stimulant. And I think that's the key stimulant that they use. And that's why I've got, in a sense, as you've said, triathlete friends who are high fat diets, but they said sometimes in the triathlon, I need that carb to give me that lift, that stimulus. So I think that's where we've got wrong. Carbohydrate metabolic effect is to prevent your blood glucose falling. That's it. And that you can only do by taking carbs during exercise. So that's why you have to take a little bit of carbs during exercise. Otherwise, the main effect is on the brain. It makes you perform better because you get a lift. And that lift can be achieved by just often putting the sugar in the carbohydrate in the mouth as well. Yeah,
we've seen that in some interesting data. I've seen that, recently, like just swishing it around in the mouth and even spitting it out can have a similar effect. And that is, we're seeing that replicated. That wasn't just 1 or 2 studies. I've seen that a few times. And then, and even with, if I recall, I don't want to butcher this, but it was basically straight malted extract or something that wasn't even sweet, if I recall. So it wasn't even something that was sweet, where we could hypothesize that yes, the taste of something sweet might kind of amp you up a little bit. But even in cases where there were carbohydrates that were not sweet, am I mistaken, or did I think that's what I saw.
No, that's right. Yeah. The problem is that the placebo control is always incredibly difficult in these studies. So all the athletes we test, by and large, they believe that carbs work. So that therefore, when you get in a laboratory and they know they're taking carbs, it's going to give them a lift just on the basis of a placebo. So that's the problem. If they taste it, they're going to feel that that's a benefit. So that it's placebo control is incredibly difficult in science. And the other thing is we're all biased towards finding what we think is true. So,
of course.
We impact the runners themselves when we're testing them. They're judging, they're watching you and saying, and watching what you're doing, and that influences their performance.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we all experience that, as athletes. It's you can consume anything, and if you believe it's going to work, it's ultimately going to work.
Yeah.
What about as far as recovery is concerned? When you're not talking about performance, you're talking about potential insulin sensitivity and all this. And you look back at the old fitness world, not necessarily endurance world, but even just the fitness community, bodybuilding world. For so long, it was, you've got to capitalize on insulin sensitivity for proper, glycogen resynthesis and everything like that. Do you think that insulin sensitivity still plays a role as far as recovery, as far as glucose uptake in an athlete, not necessarily in an unhealthy or metabolically deranged person, where they're clearly insulin resistant? Once you are, let's say, already insulin sensitive, does more insulin sensitivity help you?
The problem with insulin sensitivity is it's best that when you're 15 or 20, and it's getting worse from that moment onwards.
True.
And the more carbs you ingest, the worse it gets. So I think that the reason why you exercise is to be healthy. The reason the foods you eat, you should be also to keep you healthy. And I just worry that, sure, there's maybe 10% of the population are exquisitely healthy, and they can eat what they like, and they can take as much carbohydrate, and their insulin sensitivity will remain for the rest of their lives. But the vast majority, just get more and more insulin resistant, particularly if they're eating obviously high carbohydrate diets. So I don't think it's justifiable to tell people to eat high carbohydrate diets or to load up with carbs post-exercise, unless you're absolutely certain that this is one of the 10% in the population. But we don't do that. And in our recent paper, we showed that 10% of this group of recreational athletes who were training hard were pre-diabetic. And we did the most simple test. We did the continuous glucose monitoring, and they became absolutely rock bottom normal once they went on a high-fat diet. The traces of abnormal glucose control completely reversed. And it was really interesting. It was the ones who burnt the most fat who showed the best change. So it seemed that these people, one theory might be that their mitochondria were damaged by high carbohydrate diets, but as soon as you put them back on a high-fat diet, the mitochondria could cope well, they reduced inflammation, and you got better. I listened to athletes, and Dave Scott, who was a high-carb athlete when he won the Ironman 5 or 6 times, he says he will never tell another athlete to eat a high carbohydrate diet because he realizes it damaged him. He could have done better. He said, I would have gone 40 minutes faster, Dr. Noakes, if I'd followed your diet when I was doing the triathlon. But he said, you can't survive if you eat a high carbohydrate diet. Now, that could be because it's nutritionally deficient, or because it could be inflammation. And I think it's the inflammation story that's so important, and that you recover much better on a high-fat diet. And I'm waiting for the studies to show that. There is one study I know of where ketone supplements help the athletes recover more quickly over a period of time. It wasn't just one day, it was over a period of time. So my bias is to think that ketosis is going to help recovery and by reducing inflammation.
Do you think that even in a non-low carb athlete, let's say a moderate carb athlete, I would consider myself a moderate carb athlete, and I use myself again anecdotally here, I probably on average consume between maybe 80 and 100 grams of carbs per day, and I run probably 40 miles a week and resistance train heavily 4 to 5 days a week. So I train a lot, but still, considering how much I train, I consume a pretty low carb diet.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, if I complete a 10-mile run, and I'm almost always fasted when I train because it's just how I prefer to train, probably more than likely I'm producing ketones anyway. The natural state of ketosis, even not nutritionally induced, let's just call it exercise-induced ketosis, if that's an appropriate way to call it. Do you think by just, hey, let me take a little bit of time before I replenish, let's ride this ketogenic wave a little bit, it could actually be beneficial? It's not quelling inflammation to a point where it's a detriment to IL-6 and ultimately hindering recovery.
Yeah, I think the amount of exercise you're doing is going to burn up all that carbs, and so that you'll be You won't be highly insulinized during exercise or during the rest of your day. One of the other things, just mentioning it, is that exercise drops your insulin remarkably quickly. It's astonishing. So that if you were to eat a breakfast of 50 grams of carbs, which I'm sure you don't, you probably distribute your carbs during the day, your insulin will drop like that the moment you go out and do that 10-mile run. At the end of it, your insulin will be exceptionally low, and your glucose will also be low. That's the one thing that really can get the glucose out and the insulin down is exercise. So if we were to measure your insulin over 24 hours, you wouldn't find that it's high. Most of the time, it's going to be pretty low.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, and obviously, as we've seen and what I've seen myself is, the harder I push, I tend to get quite a dramatic glucose spike and then a pretty aggressive drop, right? Probably just a stress response at first. And then, towards the latter half of my workout, it's a very sharp cliff, very sharp drop. I also accept that there's probably a degree of peripheral insulin resistance with myself, just given that I'm, I might be a little bit of an outlier, as I ran my first marathon when I was 11 years old. And I've had a theory that, epigenetically, I may have made myself very fat adapted at a very young age. To where, I don't know if you know some of my story, but it's kind of interesting how I was a marathon runner and then I ended up ballooning up to 300 pounds or so in my 20s and was very overweight and made myself diabetic. And, things have never been fully right since then. It's amazing what just a few years of being very unhealthy can do to your metabolic health. So I still suffer to this day where it's, I wake up with relatively high fasting glucose, but at the same time, being a low carb person, I accept that there's some of that peripheral insulin resistance, but it's not until I start exercising that things drop. It's my homeostasis is a little bit higher. And then once I'm moving, it balances out.
Yeah, I was going to make that point. If your glucose goes up during exercise, I think that means you're insulin resistant. And I was classically like that too. When I was 28, doing lots of training, running marathons, we studied myself on a low carb and a high carb diet, and my glucose always went up. But when I looked at the literature, the glucose should stay normal during exercise, or if it's gone up before, it should come down. So my response was abnormal, but I didn't realize it at that time. So I think if your glucose goes up during exercise, that's a marker of insulin resistance.
Well, I mean, this was my workout this morning.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a hard workout, but I mean, I woke up around 88, and then my mid-workout was all the way up to 169, right? So
see, one of the problems with diabetes is glucagon, the action of glucagon, and that's classically a glucagon effect. That glucagon drives glucose production. So your liver's pumping out glucose, even though the muscle's using more glucose, it's not enough to regulate. The problem, as you know, is that all that showed me is that you went from 5 grams of glucose in your bloodstream to 5.5. That's the total amount of glucose in your bloodstream. But it looks terrible on the graph. Yeah. But you're out by 0.5 gram of glucose in 5 liters of blood. That's all the error in your metabolism. And that's enough to cause prediabetes or type 2 diabetes.
Wow, that's wild. I mean, what that graph doesn't show is, my insulin, of course. And, but I find it always interesting that there's just a lag, halfway through the workout, then things catch up and then there's a drop off. If I were to go out the front door right now and really run at 80% for 2 miles and really push it very hard, do something brutal like a 5K. I always joke, like I run marathons and ultra marathons because 5Ks are too hard. So it's, if I were to go out and do something like that, you probably see a pretty aggressive drop. But when I'm resistance training, it's a completely different world. So do you think that the implementation, I know you're not an expert in this world, but, monounsaturated fats, omega-7s, we're kind of seeing some of this literature out there talking about how that could help with insulin sensitivity, especially in metabolically unhealthy people. Does that warrant more research? Do you think there's something there? Do you think there's something beneficial there? Or is it really just the absence of carbohydrates for people that are metabolically unhealthy that's more important?
Yeah, I think one would be wrong to think that we can explain everything purely on carbohydrates, because if you look at how the diets have changed in the United States, but in almost all other countries, What really changed was the increase in the polyunsaturated fats, the consumption of polyunsaturated fats. And whereas the natural animal fats have progressively decreased over the last 60, 80 years. And that we have to consider that is just as important as the high carbohydrate diets. But it's escaped attention, and I don't know why that is. There's been little money, I guess, to study insulin resistant and the effects of the omega-3s and omega-6 fatty acids on it. So, I think that's an area that's worth looking into. I know in my own diet, I find it difficult to get lots of omega-3s. Short of eating lots of fish, it's kind of difficult. And when you go and look at the supplements, you worry that those omega-3s they've all fermented and they're not going to be good for you. So I think that's an area that's very worthwhile studying.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, I do notice that my glucose control seems to be better when I'm on a low carb diet with high amounts of olive oil, high amounts of macadamia nut oil, really focus on the monounsaturated fats that are a little more stable. I tend to notice that I have much more control than if I say completely throw that all to the wind and, go only lean meats or only go high saturated fat without the implementation of monounsaturated. So again, that's all my own N of one, right?
But you're not an N is one. You're more than that, because you're the canary in the cage going down the mine, because you obviously are so sensitive that your body responds very quickly in particular ways, like putting on weight. And now you've noticed this. I would take it very seriously. I'd use you as a study. I mean, because if you wonder, you really only need one experiment in life. That's the key. That you want to answer a question, you got to get the right subject and do the right experiment. And you are obviously a classic example of the type of person that needs to be studied to see how do the monounsaturated fats affect you, or the polyunsaturated fats, and see what happens. You're a case study waiting to be done.
Yeah, well, I would volunteer myself, because it's very it's intriguing. I mean, I've definitely noticed, it's why I got passionate about what I do in the first place, is because I've always taken an interest in the interesting things that happen, and I've always understood that I'm an outlier and understand that I've got kind of extreme examples. But with that, I notice very, very strong differences if I'm eating a lot of, let's say, almonds or high omega-6 type nuts. I notice a very significant difference in my ability to manage carbohydrates effectively within my body. Whereas if I'm switching that more towards a Mediterranean focused, where I'm really doing a lot more in the way of olive oils and I'm doing a lot more, I follow largely a Mediterranean low carb diet. That's pretty much what I do, because that is the only way that I can actually manage my glucose properly, and the only way that I get proper cognitive function. So it's while maintaining athletic performance.
Have you tried coconut oil? I'm just asking.
So interestingly enough, yes, I have. And for the first 4 or 5 years of my weight loss, I was living off of coconut oil. That was a very big piece for me. And, what I would find is that it actually did affect a number of things. It affected my glucose a little bit negatively, but not as much as, say, straight palmitic acid. Like if I was going with a straight, like even palm oil, or going with another kind of saturated fat. So it definitely had a different impact there. It was definitely not the same as if I'm having olive oil or avocado or macadamia nut oil.
Very interesting, because I'm not going to go try that on myself, because I have a good response. I respond well to coconut oil.
Yeah, I would get a lot of energy from it, and I would definitely notice athletic performance improvements. So what I would notice is that, and I'll give this as a caveat, direct like C8 MCT oil is like crack cocaine for me. So I hyper respond to that. So perhaps I don't respond as well to the lauric acid, to the longer chains, but I do respond really well to the C8, C10, because I mean, it's to the point where I would give that to myself during longer runs, because once I adapted to it, it wasn't affecting me digestively. So I would bring little packets of MCT oil, maybe once again, psychological, right? But 9-10 miles into a run, just have a little bit of MCT oil and I'd perk right back up. But I've always noticed that I respond very well to that, not as much with coconut oil.
Interesting. So I'll be looking into that a little bit more with greater intent, because I always look at the anecdotes or the paradoxes, and your metabolism tells me that you're the perfect person to study the role of polyunsaturated, monounsaturated fats on glucose control.
Yeah, it's wild all the way down to complexion, circles under my eyes, my quality of my skin. It's really unreal. But I tend to, when I go low carb and I don't eat a lot of poly or monounsaturated fats, I really do try to skew it towards the monos more. I find myself eating probably too much in the way of saturated fat, just because I default to that. So there's things that I have to take into account. As a result, I'm eating more red meat. I'm eating more saturated fat that way. Whereas when I'm more Mediterranean, I'm eating more lean turkey, lean fish, lean chicken, and I'm adding my fats sort of quote unquote exogenously, if you will. They're coming in from, seeds, and they're coming in from nuts and oils. So perhaps there's that equation as well, right? Yeah, I mean, I did also notice I've been on a low carb diet for, I guess, close to 12 years now. My total cholesterol is about 170. It's like, but when I was consuming coconut oil, it was a little bit higher. It was closer to, it was just a hair over 200. Granted, a lot can change in 12 years. So I'm not saying that coconut oil was a problem or was bad, but I definitely think my lipids look better now than they did even 5 or 6 years ago. One of the things, before we, kind of wrap this up, I always like to give practical takeaways. If someone is, let's just say, a moderately healthy person, they're maybe just a little bit overweight, they're not completely metabolically dysfunctional, they're not an extreme athlete, but they listen to what we're talking about. They're like saying, okay, well, what are practical, pragmatic things that I can do to get myself more fat adapted, to get myself into this state? What are a few things that people can do just as takeaways?
Yeah, I think the first mistake people make is that they have a sugar addiction or a carb addiction, and you have to address that. And I'll guess that was your problem.
Yes.
When you put on lots of weight, and that you addressed that. So maybe you can answer that question.
Yes, that was a huge component. I mean, that was probably the biggest problem. I wouldn't even say I was consuming a very high fat diet at that point in time. I was, it was heavy sugar. I was drinking, 8 or 9 fully leaded Monster energy drinks per day. And it just turned into a vicious cycle, ultimately to a point where it was a really bad time of my life, where I was, I would drink 8 or 9 Monster energy drinks and then take benzodiazepines at night to calm myself down. It was not a good time of my life. Sure. But probably close to 450 grams of carbs per day. I mean, pretty ridiculous.
Yeah. So I think that's the first point. You have to get the cravings under control. That's all the people that we help. We help them by getting rid of their cravings. And they do that by eating the diet that you're prescribing, either the Mediterranean diet or more animal saturated fat based diets. People must eat real foods. You mustn't eat ultra-processed foods, and you can't be healthy or eating ultra-processed foods. It doesn't matter how far you're running or how much you're swimming or how much you're cycling. If you're eating ultra-processed foods as the main staple of your diet, you're not going to be particularly healthy. So my takeaway is that eat healthily, and then your performance will be good, but your long-term health, which is what the key is. And I think that being in a healthy state will improve your performance much more than eating a specific so-called athletic diet. I don't see that there's an athletic diet. There's a very healthy diet, and that's the diet one needs to eat.
That makes complete sense. Do you feel that micronutrients and micronutrient deficiency play a role in our ability to athletically perform? Or because again, there's people out there that will say that it really doesn't matter as much as just the sheer macronutrient composition of our diet. But obviously, I'm inclined to think that's not true. I'm inclined to think that micronutrients play a very big role, but I'm curious your take on that, or if you've seen anything that paints a very clear picture of that.
It's a completely understudied area, because the macronutrients are the ones that are studied. And, I've been in this field for 40 years, and it's always macronutrients. We don't talk about micronutrients. And what we've shown is macronutrients make no difference. So that's the key. I don't believe the macronutrients really make any difference. but the micronutrients could well. But the only argument against that is that you look at the world's best marathon runners and they're eating a micronutrient deficient diet. I have no doubt about it. It's a highly grain-based diet and it's not a healthy diet. So you can get by in some way. How is it maybe that those, remember, we focus on a tiny proportion of all the world's runners. And they might be there only because they don't have a micronutrient deficiency, because they're metabolically slightly different.
That's a very good point. Gut microbiome's different. And I also had a theory that just depending on what you said, you look at, okay, most ultra marathoners, most ultra endurance athletes, their diets are nutritionally void of a lot of micronutrients, like you said, heavy grain based. Okay, well, in that same vein, we also see the highest incidence of upper respiratory infections. And a lot of time, they try to correlate that with glutamine. They try to correlate that with just running their bodies into the ground. And I'm thinking, just as you said, I can't help but think, is this their diet? Because I've grown up around runners and seemingly healthy people with that a lot of times, and you've probably seen it too, some of these runners can be tremendous runners, but when they're 50 years old, they look like they're 70.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
And it's like, is it the micronutrients or is it just the amount of ROS that they've generated by beating their bodies up? We may never know, but I mean, I have to ask those questions, right? Because it's like, is their diet just void of the nutrients where their immune system is suffering? I mean, it's hard to tell.
Well, I think the micronutrients, vitamins as well. And I always go back to other people, Weston Price, for example, I just missed his name for a second, who goes around the world and discovers people eating their traditional diets and being much healthier. This is in the 1930s, as you know. And what did he say? It came down to special foods. And it turns out it was vitamin D3 and K2, probably two of the key vitamins that were important. This is a sad story, but the guy who I really aspired to be like, who taught me my PhD, who would not allow me to eat any saturated fat, who would throw away the bacon and the eggs. He literally would come in, if he saw you eating bacon and eggs, he'd throw it on the floor. He died a crumpled up old man with dementia. And the answer, in my view, was that he just didn't get enough fat. He didn't get enough of the fat-soluble vitamins. And his spine just collapsed. And I'm at now 73, looking around people my age. And I look and see, are they in this position? Have they got the dead man's curve? Or are they able to do that? Have they got some flexibility in their spine? And I just think that the more carbs you eat, you just get into this position. Movement, of course, training will help, but I just see that inflexible spine from bad nutrition. And then at my age, I should probably be in an old age home but there in the old age home, everyone looks terrible because what are they eating? They're eating this rubbish, the cereals and grains. And then, but that's interesting now, coming back to your point, that the scientists who are studying runners with shin splints, particularly girls, they say, oh, it's because they're not getting enough calories. That's not the story. They're not getting nutrition, proper nutrition. That's what's happening. And they're nutritionally deficient, and they're not getting the micronutrients that they need.
Oh, makes complete sense. I mean, to me, the body is perfectly capable of using its own on-hand energy systems. And I think when we look, although I understand thermodynamics, I understand that discussion. I'm not trying to discount it because I know people like to kind of attack that. But I think that we also need to understand that the body is very, very keen on being able to pull from its existing stores, and that includes recovery. And I think the problem is quite the opposite, is we baby the body almost too much in that sense. We don't allow it to actually utilize its own stores now and then. So we've, in essence, sort of enabled it, like you enable a spoiled child, right?
Actually, yeah, I quite agree with you. And, the fact that the world's greatest athletes in East Africa come from poor communities, and they haven't had great nutrition, but yet they've survived, and somehow they've survived and been successful. Tells me that the body's really capable of doing remarkable things.
Oh, that's amazing, man. Well, before we go, where can everyone find you? And can you just talk a little bit about the Noakes Foundation, just so everyone can know where to find you and what you're all about?
Sure, Thomas. So my father died of type 2 diabetes, and I watched him die. And because I was a medical doctor, I should have been able to help him. But of course, I couldn't, because he followed the same standard treatments, which kills you if you have diabetes. So I developed type 2 diabetes, probably genetically, but also because of the high carb diet and the high polyunsaturated fat diet that we ate. And I've reversed it on the low carbohydrate diet. And so I basically should already have significant symptoms and complications, because my dad died 10 years after the diagnosis. I'm now 13 or 14 years after the diagnosis. So I'm not saying I'm going to live forever, but I'm doing okay now. And I think it's only because of the low carbohydrate diet. So I wanted to educate the public and physicians about the low carbohydrate diet. So we formed the Noakes Foundation, and our focus was originally to do research on low carbohydrate diets and bring this to the public. And next month, we have one of the real achievements of the Noakes Foundation, which is astonishing. We got 62 of the world's leading low carb people to write chapters for a textbook, which we're coming out in 1 month's time. 250,000 words of the very best people describing what low carbohydrate diets do for every single organ in the body. It's a medical textbook, the first medical textbook. And what we show is the low carbohydrate diet is the most studied diet in the world. It's also the most effective. So now no one is going to be able to say, there's nothing, we don't know anything about the low carb diet, it's dangerous. There's the evidence. So that was the first thing. The second thing we've done is developed an organization called the Nutrition Network, because we wanted to focus on teaching doctors the low carb movement. And so we have a series of programs that we offer via the internet, and people can purchase these programs and teach themselves all about the low carbohydrate diets and its use in medicine. So those are two of the main functions. Our third one is the Eat Better South Africa campaign, where we tried to get good nutrition to the poorest people and to show that even people in poverty can still eat a much better diet than the diet that they're currently eating. So those are some of the things we're doing. And the fourth thing we're trying to raise money, and I just mentioned that we're trying to raise money for a documentary on my career and life. And that's being organized by Donnell O'Neill, who produced the film The Serial Killers and a couple of other very famous documentaries. So that would be one of the fourth projects that we're doing.
Perfect. Well, I'll put a link down below to the Kickstarter for that as well.
Thank you so much. That'd be lovely. So if you want to contact me, you can follow me on Twitter at Prof. Tim Noakes. I'm quite controversial, as you can see, and I tackle issues of the day. And I just think we've got many real issues that go well beyond nutrition in the world today.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. And, I love your piece on, people want to check some stuff out. There's an interesting piece you put out on academic bullying, which I think is very fascinating and very, very real. And it happens on social media too, where you sort of, if you have any opinion that is slightly different, you tend to get, just a cloud of noise surrounding you, and it's
that's right.
Yeah. So anyhow, it's just interesting. So everyone can kind of check that stuff out too. Well, Professor, I appreciate your time, and I'll make sure I link out to all your social channels and everything below, and you have a good evening there.
Thank you. It's been a privilege and a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you. And I wish you all success with everything you do.